She was bound in chains, but one silent rancher would alter her destiny forever. The rope cut into her wrists before the wagon even stopped. Clara Dove had been sold twice in the same week. The first time was by the man who called himself her guardian. The second time was at the edge of a nameless town in the Arizona Territory, where a cattle broker named Holt Calder had paid 3 gold coins for her labor and signed a paper that meant nothing under any law that still held its breath out here. She was 19 years old. She had a bruise below her left eye and dust in her hair and nothing else that was still hers. The wagon rolled into the yard of a ranch called Cold Creek. The name was painted on a plank nailed above the gate, the letters sun-bleached down to ghosts. The land stretched flat in every direction, so broken only by mesquite and the distant cut of a dry riverbed. The sky above was the kind of pale blue that promised heat and delivered it without apology. Holt Calder climbed down from the wagon board and stretched his back like a man who owned every inch of everything he could see. He had a belly that strained his shirt buttons and small eyes set too close together. And when he smiled, his teeth were the color of old wood. He dropped the rope end in the dirt and walked toward the ranch house without looking back. Clara did not move. She had learned that waiting was its own kind of weapon. A barn door opened on the far side of the yard. A man came out. He was tall, wide across the shoulders, wearing a worn canvas coat the color of dried mud. He had a hat pulled low and did not walk fast or slow. He walked like a man who had already decided what he was going to do and saw no need to announce it. His face was angular and weathered, cut by years of sun and wind into something that looked less like a face and more like a piece of the land itself. He had a scar that ran from his jaw to his collar, thin and old, white against the brown of his skin. His name was Cal Briggs. He owned Cold Creek, every acre, every fence post, every sorry-looking steer that wandered the back pasture. He had bought it from a dead man's estate 7 years ago with money he earned the hard way, and he had worked it alone ever since. The people in town knew him the way people know a mountain. They noted his existence and left him alone. He walked across the yard and stopped in front of Clara. He looked at the rope on her wrists. He looked at her face. He looked at Calder's back, still retreating toward the house. He pulled a knife from his belt. The blade was short and clean. He cut the rope in one motion and stepped back. Clara did not flinch. She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who had run out of the kind of hope that flinches. Cal said nothing. He folded the knife and put it away. He turned and walked back toward the barn. After a moment, she followed. Inside the barn, it smelled like horses and dry straw and the particular quiet that large animals make when they are calm. Cal went to a water bucket near the stall partition and lifted it and set it on the edge of the rail closest to her. Beside it, he set a folded cloth and a small tin that held something that smelled like pine and herb. He pointed at her wrists. She understood. She cleaned the rope burns herself. He gave her the space to do it. He went back to the horse he had apparently been working with before she arrived and resumed brushing its flank without another glance in her direction. That was the first thing she noticed about Cal Briggs. He did not look at her like she was a problem to be solved or a thing to be assessed. He looked at her the way he looked at the horse, with attention that expected nothing and demanded nothing. Calder appeared in the barn doorway after 20 minutes. He was holding a tin cup and a folded paper and a satisfaction that sat on him like a bad smell. He told Cal that the girl was contracted for 6 months. General labor, cooking and cleaning, whatever call needed around the property. He said she was trouble if left idle. He said the paper was legal. He said he would be back to collect at the end of the term. Cal did not stop brushing the horse. He said, "Leave the paper." That was all. Calder set the paper on the rail and left. The sound of his wagon faded out through the gate, and then there was just the wind and the hoarse breathing and the distant creak of a windmill that needed oil. Clara looked at the paper. Cal looked at it too. Then he picked it up and folded it and put it in his coat pocket and picked up the brush again. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" He said, "Nothing yet." She said, "That paper says you own my work for 6 months." He said, "Paper says a lot of things." She waited. He said, "There is a room in the back of the house. Small. Latch on the inside. You keep the latch." She did not understand right away. He said, "You keep the latch." "Not me. You." Something moved through her chest then. Some old familiar weight that shifted its position without leaving. She had not had a door with a latch on the inside in 4 years. It was such a small thing. The smallness of it was almost the worst part. She did not cry. She had dried all of that out a long time ago. She said, "What do you need done around this place?" He said, "Everything." And then he almost smiled. It was a poor attempt at a smile, like a man who had gone so long without practicing that the muscles had forgotten the exact motion. But it was there. Half a second, gone. He said, "You cook or you mend or you do neither. Your choice. The work needs doing, and there is more of it than one man can manage. That is all this is." Clara looked at the barn, the horse, the man, the open door behind her leading to the yard and the gate beyond. She said, "I will need different boots. These are coming apart." He nodded once. He said, "Town is 8 miles east. We go Friday." She said, "Today is Wednesday." He said, "Yes." She picked up the cloth from the rail and folded it and handed it back to him. Her wrists still burned, but she held them still. She said, "What do you need done before Friday?" He told her. She did it. That was how it began. Not with promises. Not with explanations. Just 2 people in a barn in Arizona with the wind coming through the gaps in the boards and the sun going down outside and a great deal of work that needed doing. Somewhere 8 miles west, Holt Calder was already spending the 3 gold coins. And somewhere further than that, in a town called Red Fork, a man named Dutch Varner was reading a letter with Cold Creek written at the top. Dutch Varner did not like loose ends. And Clara Dove, he had decided 4 years ago, was the loosest end he had ever left. Calder's wagon was barely dust on the horizon when Dutch Varner's name came back to Clara like a stone dropped into still water. She had spent 3 years trying to put distance between herself and that name. She had changed towns twice, changed her last name once, taken work wherever work did not ask questions. She had been a laundress in Tucson, a cook's helper in a mining camp outside of Bisbee, a seamstress in a boarding house that burned down 3 weeks after she arrived, which she had not taken personally, but had noted. Bad luck had a pattern with her. Tupast had arrived on horseback, and it smelled like leather and tobacco and the particular cologne that Dutch Varner wore, which was expensive and wrong for a man like him, like a snake wearing a ribbon. She thought about the letter she had seen through the window of Calder's office in town, 2 weeks before Calder brought her out here. She had not read it. She had only seen the seal at the bottom, a burned circle around the initials DV, pressed into red wax. Dutch Varner used that seal on everything. It was the kind of vanity that made small men feel large. She did not know what the letter said. She knew it had something to do with her. She knew because Calder's whole manner had changed after reading it. He had stopped treating her like a nuisance and started treating her like a commodity again, watching her with that careful merchant's gaze, calculating value and transport cost. Clara swept the kitchen floor of the ranch house on her first morning at Cold Creek and thought about this and did not let herself spiral into the fear that lived at the bottom of it. Spiraling was a luxury. She did not have room for it. The house was dusty and functional and thoroughly male. Cal had lived in it alone long enough that every object in it existed because it was needed, and nothing existed for any other reason. There were no curtains. There was a coffee tin and a flour sack and a cast-iron skillet that had been properly seasoned and clearly cared for, which told her something about him that she filed away. A man who takes care of his tools is a man who plans to stay. She found coffee and made it. Walker Cal came in from the east pasture at mid-morning with a split along his palm from a fence wire. He sat at the table without being asked, and she found the pine tin she had used the day before, and cleaned the cut and wrapped it with a strip of cloth she cut from the bottom of her own skirt hem because there was no bandaging in the house that she could locate. He watched her work. He said, "You've done that before." She said, "Tended cuts?" He said, "Stayed calm while doing it." She did not answer that. He accepted the coffee she set beside him. He drank it without comment, which meant it was good. She had learned long ago that silence after food or drink is a better compliment than words. He said, "There is a fence line on the south side that is down in 3 places. I need to ride it today. You can come or stay." She said, "I will come." No, he looked at her for a moment, not assessing. More like confirming something he had already half decided. They rode out together at noon. He gave her a bay mare named Dolly, who was gentle and plodding and clearly offended by any pace faster than a considered walk. Clara had ridden before, badly, and Dolly seemed to understand this and compensated by simply refusing to do anything dangerous. She appreciated this about the horse. They understood each other on a foundational level. The south fence was down badly in the first spot, wire dragged loose by something heavy. Cal dropped from his horse and crouched and read the ground, the way some men read newspapers. He moved along the break slowly, following something only he could see. He said, "Mountain lion. Big one. Been circling the south herd for 2 weeks." She said, "That why you have been out at night?" He looked up. She had heard him leave twice before dawn since she arrived. She noticed things. She could not help it. Noticing things had kept her breathing this long. He said, "Yes." He began pulling the wire back, and she dismounted and held the post steady without being asked, figuring out what he needed from watching the angle of his hands. They worked like that for an hour, not talking much. The sun pressing down, the dry grass moving in the wind like it was breathing. By the third break, she had gotten better at reading what he needed, and he had gotten better at positioning himself so she could read it easier. It was the kind of cooperation that does not get discussed. It just develops between people who are paying attention to the same thing. On the ride back, he said, "You are not what Calder described." She said, "What did he describe?" He said, "Troublesome, sullen, hard to manage." She said, "I am all of those things." He said, "Not yet." She looked at him, the half-smile again. This one lasted a full second before it went. She said, "Did you know him before?" Calder. Cal was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He came to me. Said he had a work contract and needed someone willing to manage it. I told him I needed hands. I should have asked more questions." She said, "Would he have answered them honestly?" Cal said no. She said, "Then the questions would not have changed anything." He seemed to sit with that. The horses walked. The windmill at the ranch creaked somewhere ahead of them. He said, "The paper Calder left. I looked at it last night." She waited. He said, "It is not a legal document." Most not under territorial law. It is a bill of sale for a horse with a name crossed out and yours written over it. The air went very still around her. He said, I am not going to enforce it. She said, I know. He looked at her. She said, I knew that the first hour. A man who uses a bill of sale for a horse to bind a person does not know that person has been through worse paper than that. And a man who gives a woman the latch on the inside of her door is not planning to take anything from her. He turned back to the trail. She said, what I need to know is whether Dutch Varner found me through Calder or whether Calder found me through Varner. Cal pulled his horse up. He turned slowly and looked at her with full attention for the first time since she arrived. Not the edge of his gaze. All of it. She said, there was a sealed letter in Calder's office 2 weeks ago. Dutch Varner's seal. I have been running from Varner for 4 years, and every time I think I've gotten clear, a Calder type appears. They are connected somehow. I do not know how yet. Cal was quiet for a long time. The horses stood and the wind moved the grass, and somewhere far to the south, a hawk made a long, slow circle. He said, Dutch Varner. He said it the way a man says a name. He has been careful not to say out loud. She looked at him. He said, Dutch Varner killed my brother. The hawk turned once more and dropped out of sight below the mesa line. She said, when? He said, 6 years ago. Outside of Red Fork. They called it a fair fight. It was not. She said, I was in Red Fork 6 years ago. The words sat between them on the open plain. He said, how old were you? She said 13. He did not ask anything else. He did not need to. The arithmetic of what she had been doing in Red Fork at 13, under Dutch Varner's shadow, wrote itself in the space between them without either of them putting a word to it. He said, he is coming here. It was not a question. She said, yes, I think so. I think the letter told Calder to bring me somewhere Varner could collect. I think this ranch was the somewhere. Cal looked out at the land around them. All of it his, all of it earned hard. He said, then we have until Friday. She said, what happens Friday? He said, Calder comes back to check the contract. If Varner is using Calder as a messenger, Varner will not be far behind. She said, what do you want to do? He thought about that for a long time. Long enough that she started to think he was not going to answer. Then he said, I want to finish what I started 6 years ago. He turned his horse back toward the ranch. She followed. The plan did not exist yet. It was just a direction. Two people pointing themselves at the same thing for different reasons. That is usually how the best plans begin. Cal Briggs had not spoken Dutch Varner's name out loud in 6 years. He had thought it every day. Early mornings, working the fence line, checking the herd alone in the blue hour before sunrise. The name was always there, sitting at the back of his mind like a stone in a boot that he had gotten used to walking with. You stop noticing constant pain, but it is still pain. His brother's name was Pete. Pete Briggs had been 22 years old when Dutch Varner shot him over a card game that Pete did not start and was not winning. The town of Red Fork said it was fair. Dutch Varner had a lawyer and a witness and enough money to make sure the paperwork landed the right direction. Pete landed in the Red Fork Cemetery with a pine marker that was probably rotted through by now. Cal had ridden to Red Fork the following spring with a loaded rifle and a clear intention. He had gotten within 2 miles of town before he turned around. Not because he was afraid, because Pete would have hated it. Pete was the kind of man who believed that the worst thing a person could do was become the thing they hated. And Cal had stood on that road outside Red Fork and known with a cold certainty that if he rode into town that day, Nonasa Pete would have lost something more important than his life. So he turned around. He came to Arizona. He found this land, and he bought it, and he worked it, and he built something out of the raw ground with his hands, because that was what was left to do. The grief did not go away. It just found a different shape. It became the fence line and the herd and the weight of a shovel and the long silence of a man who has decided to stay living. Dutch Varner had apparently decided that staying in Red Fork was not enough. Cal sat at the kitchen table that night after Clara had gone to her room, and he went through what he knew, the way he would go through a fence line, looking for the breaks. Varner ran Red Fork the way a spider runs a web. He did not own the businesses officially. He was never the name on the deed. But every deed in Red Fork had a thread attached that led back to him. He dealt in people the way other men dealt in cattle. Not slaves, not in the plain sense, but in the older and more flexible sense of the word. In people who owed him, or feared him, or were young enough and alone enough that owing and fearing felt like the only options available. Clara had been one of those people at 13. Cal thought about this and felt something move in his chest that was not anger exactly. Anger was too clean a word for it. It was something closer to the feeling of standing over a field that is burned and knowing the fire was set on purpose. He got up and went to the locked box under the floorboard near the stove and took out two things. The first was a folded letter. Not Calder's letter. His own. Delivered 6 weeks ago by a rider who left before Cal could ask any questions. The letter said that Dutch Varner was expanding his operation westward into Arizona territory, and that Cold Creek sat on land Varner had decided he wanted. It said that arrangements were being made. It was signed with that burned circle seal. The second thing was a deputy's badge from the Territorial Marshal's office in Tucson. Cal had carried it for 3 years. He had never used it in a way that meant anything. He had reported 2 cattle rustlers and 1 man who had been selling bad water rights, and the marshal's office had done exactly nothing about any of them. The badge was more symbol than authority out here. But it was still something. He set both objects on the table. He looked at them. The door to Clara's room opened. She came out in the dark, moving quietly, and stopped when she saw him at the table. She looked at the badge. She looked at the letter. She sat down across from him without asking permission. She said, "He sent you a letter too." He said, 6 weeks ago. She said, "He wants the land." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is why Calder brought me here specifically. Varner knew you had the badge. He sent me as a complication, a reason for you to be distracted or discredited or both." Cal looked at her. She said, "I am not being self-important. I know how Varner thinks. He has been thinking in triangles for 30 years. He does not come at a thing directly. He sends something that forces the other person to make a choice that costs them either way. If you help me, he has something to use against you. If you do not help me, he still gets what he wants and you lose the land anyway." Cal said, "What did you do that made him chase you 4 years?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I witnessed something in Red Fork." He waited. She said, "The night your brother died, I saw it. The whole thing. I was across the street, in the alley. Pete Briggs did not draw first. Varner drew first, and Pete drew to defend himself, and Varner's witness lied about the order. I was 13, and I was not going to be believed, and Varner knew I was there because he looked right at me when it was done." The kitchen was very quiet. Cal set his hands flat on the table. She said, "I ran that night. I have been running since. Every time I stop long enough to be findable, Calder or someone like Calder shows up to collect me. I think Varner wants me dead. I think he has wanted me dead for 4 years and been patient about it because patience is what he does. Cal looked at his hands. Pete Briggs had not drawn first. He had known it. He had felt it in the marrow of every year since. But knowing a thing and having a living witness to it were two entirely different instruments. He said, "Would you testify to it?" She looked at him with eyes that had already been through this calculation and come out the other side. She said, "That is why I am still alive. As long as I have not testified, there is a reason to keep me findable instead of just removing me. Once I testify, that calculation changes." He said, "Unless the testimony is enough to destroy him." She said, "It would have to be in front of a judge that Varner does not own. It would have to be documented and sealed before he could move. It would have to happen fast." Cal picked up the badge. He said, "The circuit judge comes through Benson in 9 days." She said, "Varner will be here before then." He said, "Yes." She said, "What do we do in the time between?" He set the badge down on the letter. He said, "We make this ranch very difficult to approach without being seen." She said, "You know how to do that." He said, "I know how to do that." She said, "What do you need me to do?" He told her. They sat at that table until the lamp oil burned low, and the plan stopped being a direction and became something with edges and weight and the cold, specific shape of a thing that is either going to work or not, with no middle ground available. Outside, the Arizona night was wide open and full of stars and absolutely indifferent to any of it. Inside, two people who had both lost something to the same man sat at a table and rebuilt their losses into something that pointed forward. The badge sat between them. Neither of them touched it again that night. There was no need. It had already said what it was going to say. Friday came with a hard wind from the north and a sky the color of a tin roof. Clara had spent Thursday doing 3 things. She had mapped every approach to the ranch on foot and on horseback, walking the perimeter twice, noting the sight lines, the natural cover, the places where a rider could come within a quarter mile without being visible from the house. She had inventoried what was in the barn and the kitchen that could serve as something other than its original purpose. And she had written out in her own handwriting, in the clearest language she could manage, a full account of what she witnessed in Red Fork 6 years ago, with the date and the names and the order of events. She sealed it in an envelope and wrote the name of the circuit judge on the outside. Cal had ridden to the nearest neighbor, a rancher named Gus Farrow, who was 70 years old and owned a shotgun and bore a grudge against Holt Calder that went back to a water rights dispute in 1879. Gus had agreed to ride to Benson and put the envelope in the judge's office hands, not Postal Service hands, before the end of the week. Gus left Thursday morning. The envelope was either in Benson or it was not. There was nothing to do about it now. Calder arrived at Cold Creek at mid-morning Friday in the same wagon, wearing the same satisfaction. Accompanied this time by 2 men who rode on either side of him and wore their guns the way men wear them when the guns are the point. Cal was standing in the yard when the wagon came through the gate. Clara was in the barn, not hiding, working. Close to the rifle Cal had positioned behind the second stall post. Calder climbed down and looked around the yard with the searching expression of a man who expected to find something changed or missing. He said, "Where is the girl?" Cal said, "Working." Calder said, "I need to see her." Cal said, "Why?" Calder's expression shifted. The 2 men on horseback moved their horses slightly apart, the way men do when they are making space for something to happen. Calder said, "Change of plans on the contract. I need to collect her early." Cal said, "The contract runs 6 months." Calder said, "The terms changed." Cal said, "The contract terms do not change without both signatures. You told me that yourself." Calder looked at him for a moment with those small, crowded eyes. Then he looked past Cal toward the barn. He said, "Dutch Varner sends his regards." Cal said, "I know." Calder stopped. He said, "You know." Cal said, "I have known since the letter 6 weeks ago. I have been waiting to see how Varner planned to play it." The two riders were very still now. Calder said, "Then you know it is better for everybody if you step aside." Cal said, "Everybody except the people who get stepped on." He said it flat, no heat in it. The way he said everything, it landed the same way. Calder looked at the barn again. He said, "Dutch Varner is 2 hours behind me on the trail. This does not have to go badly for you." Cal said, "It already went badly for me. 6 years ago in Red Fork." Calder's face did something complicated. Cal said, "I am a deputy of the Territorial Marshal's Office. Holt Calder, I am placing you under arrest for the fraudulent sale of a labor contract and the transport of a person under false legal pretense. You can come quietly, or you cannot." One of the riders reached for his gun. The barn door opened. Clara came out with the rifle up and her stance square and the look on her face of someone who learned to shoot out of the same necessity she had learned everything else in her life. The rider's hand stopped moving. The second rider looked at Cal and then at Clara and then at the sky as if he was calculating whether this situation was worth the daily wage. Calder was paying him and apparently decided it was not. He raised both hands. The first rider reconsidered at speed and raised his hands as well. Calder stood in the yard, and his satisfaction leaked out of him like air from a bad tire. And what was underneath it was smaller and older and afraid. Cal walked forward and took the gun from his belt. He said, "Tie them." Clara lowered the rifle and went to the post where the rope was coiled. Calder said, "You cannot stop Varner. You know that." Cal said nothing. Calder said, "He has men and lawyers, and he has been doing this for 30 years. 2 people on a broken-down ranch cannot stop Dutch Varner." Cal said, "We are not trying to stop him." Calder looked confused. Cal said, "We are just making sure we are still standing when he arrives." They secured Calder and his 2 men in the barn, and Cal took position by the fence line to the east, as where the trail from Red Fork came in. Clara stood at the window of the house with a rifle and the 2-hour wait that felt like the longest wait of her life. Which was saying something, because her life had contained some very long waits. She watched the eastern trail. She thought about Pete Briggs and a dark alley in Red Fork and a girl of 13 who ran and kept running and somehow ended up here, on a piece of Arizona ground that belonged to Pete's brother, holding a rifle, waiting to watch the man who upended both their lives ride into the yard where they were ready for him. The wind came through the window. Somewhere in the house, a door with a latch on the inside stood open. She had left it open herself this morning. She did not need it closed anymore. Dutch Varner arrived at Cold Creek at noon with 4 men, and the ease of a man who has never once in his life pulled a trigger on an empty chamber. He was older than Clara remembered. 6 years does that. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and he wore a coat that cost more than this ranch was worth. And he rode a black horse that was the best-looking thing for 20 miles in any direction. He had that expensive cologne on. She could almost smell it from the house window. He rode through the gate and looked at the empty yard and pulled up. He looked at the house. He looked at the barn. He did not see what he expected to see. Cal stepped out from the east side of the yard, the side Varner had not come from. He said, "Dutch Varner." Varner turned his horse. He looked at Cal for a long moment, and then he almost smiled. It was a better smile than Cal's. More practiced. It had been used to charm and deceive a great many people over 3 decades. He said, Cal Briggs, I heard you were still out here. Good land. Man would hate to lose it. Cal said, you sent me a letter about that. Varner said, a business proposition. Still open. Cal said, where is your lawyer? Varner's smile held. He said, I did not think I would need him. Cal said, you need him. Varner looked at the four men around him. They were good men, hired men, the kind who do not ask questions and can be replaced. He looked at Cal, who was one man standing in a yard. He said, you have a deputy's badge. I have 4 men and a lawyer in Benson who has worked with the Territorial Land Office for 15 years. I have the Calder contract. I have patience that you cannot outlast. Why would I need to rush this? Cal said, you are under arrest for the murder of Pete Briggs. Red Fork, 6 years ago. The yard went quiet in a way that had weight. Varner's smile did not change exactly, but something behind it changed. Something cold came through. He said, that was a fair fight. There was a witness. Cal said, there was another witness. Varner looked at the house. The front door opened. Clara walked out. She did not have the rifle. She did not need it. She walked out into the yard and stood in the open air of Arizona under that wide, pale sky and looked at Dutch Varner directly for the first time since she was 13 years old and hiding in an alley with her heart beating out of her chest and dust on her face and the knowledge of something terrible freshly written into her. She was 23 now. The dust was different dust. Varner looked at her. The smile was gone. He said, nobody will believe a drifting girl over 6 years of settled record. She said, a signed and witnessed account delivered to Circuit Judge Harold Briggs of Benson 3 days ago might have something to say about that. Varner went very still. She said, the judge's name is a coincidence. He is no relation that I know of. But he is honest, which is the part that matters. One of Varner's men shifted in his saddle. Cal said, your 4 men are hired. They are not loyal. You know the difference. I know you know the difference because you have spent 30 years making sure the difference stays clear. They are not going to draw on a deputy's badge over your wage. He looked at the 4 men. Not one of them moved toward a gun. Varner sat on his black horse in the yard of Cold Creek and looked at 2 people who had been running from him in different directions for years and had somehow ended up facing the same direction, at him. He said, you think this ends here? Cal said, this part of it does. Varner looked at the sky, at the land, at the deed that was not going to be his. He had built 30 years on a system that worked because people were alone when he came for them. A 13-year-old girl in an alley. A young man in a card game with no friends present. A rancher with a badge that had never been used in anger. The system required isolation. What was standing in this yard was the opposite of that. He rode out. His men rode out after him. Not because they were fleeing, because the calculation had changed, and they were men who followed calculations. Calder, still secured in the barn, began making noise. Cal went to deal with it. Clara stayed in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats was gone. The wind moved the dry grass, and the windmill turned, and the sky above was enormous and pale and completely unconcerned with anything that happened below it. Which was, she thought, probably the correct response. She had testified. The envelope was in Benson. Varner was not done, not permanently, not without the legal proceeding that would follow, which would be long and ugly and fought by expensive lawyers in a territory where money still carried weight. She knew that. Cal knew that. But the account existed now. It was out of her hands and into a system that could, if the judge was honest and the law held, do the thing the law was supposed to do. She had been running for 4 years, holding a truth she could not put down. She had put it down. Her hands felt strange without the weight. Cal came back from the barn and stood beside her. He said, "Gus Farrow will need a witness statement from you in Benson. Formal. Before the judge." She said, "I know." He said, "It will take several days, maybe a week." She said, "I know." He said, "Cold Creek will need tending while I'm gone." She looked at him. He said, "Unless you want to come." She looked at the barn and the house and the fence line disappearing east and the land stretching out flat and enormous in every direction. She said, "I want to come." He nodded once. They went inside. She made coffee. He sat at the table and she set the cup beside him, and he drank it without comment, which meant it was good. Outside, the windmill turned and the dry grass moved, and the land held its long patience the way land does, quiet and wide, waiting for the people on it to figure out what they were going to do next. She sat down across from him. She put both hands flat on the table. Her wrists were healed. The rope marks had faded down to thin white lines that she would carry the rest of her life, which was fine. She had carried worse things. Some of those things she was finally done carrying. Some of them she would carry differently now. That was enough. That was more than enough. The coffee was hot and the wind was outside, and the door to her room stood open with the latch on the inside where she had put it herself. She stayed